Hello, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining this session at RM EduSummit. In this session, we're going to be hearing from Pete Collison and Mark House from RM, as well as Daniel Mace from Langley Grammar School on why digital assessment is key to authentic, impactful and future-proof assessment. If you've got any questions throughout the presentation, please pop them in the Q&A box, which you'll find in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. And if at any point you want to see the presenter's slides or screen in full view, then there's an icon for that in the top right-hand corner if you just hover over the presenter's slides. But without further ado, I'll hand you over to Pete.
Super, thanks for the introduction, Mel, and thanks to all of you that are choosing to join us this afternoon. It's great to have you here and look forward to talking to you over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. I'm going to be kicking us off today. I'm one of three speakers you've got today. I'm Head of Formative Assessment at RM. I'm joined by my colleague Mark House, who's the Product Manager for RM Compare, which we're going to be talking about a little bit later on in this session. And I'm really delighted to have joining us today Daniel Mace, who's the Assistant Head Teacher at Langley Grammar School. And Daniel and his school are one of the early adopters of RM Compare. So he's going to be talking to you a little bit later on about his experiences of why he chose to work with RM on this and what he's been doing with the tool and what he's been finding over the last couple of months. So we're really excited to hear from Daniel about his experiences so far. I'm going to start us off with a couple of sort of sections of the presentation, probably only 10-15 minutes or so. We're going to kick off with a bit of a brief history of digital assessment, just to set the scene slightly, because I'm mindful that for many of you joining this call, you may know RM very well, and you may know RM from sort of a school's technology point of view, and you may know a little bit less about what RM has been doing in the space of digital assessment for many of our exam board and exam body customers around the world. So I'm going to give you a very quick overview of what RM's been doing over the last sort of 10 or so years in the assessment space globally. I'm then going to share with you some recent research that we conducted in partnership with C3 Education, asking schools in the UK specifically about how they feel they're getting on with delivering formative assessment right now in the context of obviously education having been under significant disruption over the last 12 months or so, and some really interesting findings have come out of that. So I'm going to give you a bit of a headline on that just to really set the scene. And then, as I mentioned, finally, I'll hand over to Mark and to Daniel, who together will shine a bit of a spotlight on one of our newer products, RM Compare, which we think has got really huge potential to make a positive difference in a number of things that we'll talk about today. So without further ado, let's kick on with a bit of a brief history of digital assessment and some examples of what's happened to that over the course of the last few years. And digital assessment means different things to different people, but in its sort of simplest sense, it effectively is digitizing one or all of the assessment process. And I'm not going to dwell too much today on how you can digitize some of the back office parts of assessment. So setting exams, creating questions, marking them, producing results, etc. I'm going to focus today primarily on the test taker experience, the student experience. And what you can see on screen here is a good example of what I think you might consider digital assessment 0.1. So this is a great example of where a test was previously administered on paper and it has simply been copied like for like onto a screen. So the exam has been digitized, you could say. It's a perfectly fine process. It's a perfectly sensible thing to do. But what you'll notice with this particular example, and there are many, I don't pick on this example for any particular reason. I could have chosen from hundreds. But what you'll notice is that this approach doesn't really make use of any of the benefits that you get from digitizing the exam. It's presenting the question in exactly the same way, asking for exactly the same kind of response from the learner. Visually, it's no different. The interaction is no different. The user experience is no different. It's a good starting point, but it certainly shouldn't be the end of the journey. What we've seen more recently then is working with some of our exam body customers and professional accreditation customers. We're starting to see some significantly more advanced approaches come to market. So this example here is one that we've developed in partnership with an accountancy body that we work with. And what they came to us with a challenge is that to say, okay, our students are professional accountants. They're employed, they're working, they're highly skilled individuals, and they live in a world where they have Excel, they have spreadsheets, they have smartphones, they have all these things at their disposal. And we want our assessments to reflect that real world experience. We want our assessments to be authentic to that world. So we've developed with them a system whereby a student can now take an assessment and have at their fingertips in an exam environment all of the materials and books that they would want. It's essentially an open book exam, and also all the features and functions of Excel. Because the purpose of this assessment is not to assess their ability to use Excel. The purpose of the assessment now is to assess their ability to think critically, to problem solve, to analyze data, to communicate their analysis and their thoughts. The fact that they're using Excel to do the heavy lifting and crunch numbers is fine, because that's exactly what they would do in their real world. So we're starting to see now where digital assessment can unlock things that simply couldn't be done with pen and paper, which is a really exciting forward step. The next area where we see some really interesting things happen is around sort of candidate personalization. So this is an example from another exam body that we work with, and they asked us to come up with an assessment interface that was a bit more personal to their students. So you can see in this particular example, it's a relatively standard layout. The student in this case is an English exam. They have some resources on the right-hand side. They have, in this case, a piece of poetry they can read, and the question in the middle. The question is fairly straightforward, but the really interesting bit here is what's in the bottom left-hand corner. So the student, the user now, the person taking the exam, can customize how they interact. They can increase the font size. So if they're partially sighted or have visualization issues, they can increase the font. They can change the contrast. They can also change the background color. So if they have any form of dyslexia or anything similar, it's well proven that changing the background color can often help with that. So students can do that. And really interestingly, the student can also choose at the click of a button whether to have the exam in English or, in this case, Maori. So the entire system can switch language at the flick of a button at the whim of the user. So it's a much more personalized experience. It's a much more unique experience to the candidate, which results in a far better experience, something, again, you just couldn't replicate with pen and paper. The final example I want to just share with you, and again, I could have picked many. This is an example where we're now starting to assess coding. So this starts to get into the field of assessing things that just can't really be assessed at all with pen and paper, not in any sense. So here's an example using the Scratch coding platform, or something very similar to, where in this case, students are being asked to write a simple program to allow a drone to drop seeds across a field. So really nice that we can sort of embed that kind of coding technology into an assessment platform and ask students to undertake tasks in an assessment environment and capture the outcomes and data of that. So that's a bit of a journey of digital assessment, and hopefully you can see there that where we're now working is far removed from that first example we gave you, and we're starting to make much better use of all of the opportunities that digital assessment provide. It's the tip of the iceberg, and clearly there's an awful lot more that can and will be done as the years go forward, but it's certainly an exciting space to be. Very briefly, RM has capability across the full end-to-end of assessment. So although we focused today on test delivery and the test taker experience, RM certainly has experience in the full end-to-end of developing questions right through to delivering that assessment, grading it, and providing analytics and useful intelligence out of the back end, including feedback for students and teachers. And indeed, when we talk about RM Compare in just a few minutes, you'll see on here, RM Compare really does span that sort of end of the spectrum from analysing students' work and providing feedback and some good reporting. And we do quite a lot of this. So in any typical year, and it's probably fair to say that the last 12 months haven't been overly typical, but in a typical year, we would do an awful lot of assessment for our customers globally. Upwards of 30,000 tests per day go through many of our platforms. Every year, we scan and digitize about 200 million pieces of exam paper, and around 13 million assessments are marked through our platforms every year. So we're doing this really on a global scale, and this is increasing year on year. So it's a really exciting space to be. I hope that was useful context. I'm going to move on now just to my second part before I hand over to Mark and then to Daniel, because I want to share with you some research that we've done around formative assessment specifically. So we were aware that formative assessment got overlooked to some extent in the early days of the pandemic, because a lot of the focus, quite rightly, was on how do we ensure that teaching and learning continues. And a little bit less thought was put into how do we assess that learning and that teaching. And that's entirely right. That priority was absolutely correct. So what we wanted to do was to do a bit of work to ask teachers, subject leaders, curriculum leaders in UK schools how they felt formative assessment was going right now for them, and how has the pandemic had an impact on that. We surveyed about 1,000 schools across the UK, so 2/3 of those were in England, the other third were in the home nations, across primary and secondary. And we asked curriculum leaders and heads of subject, essentially, to answer a number of questions for us. And some of the highlights in terms of responses, I'm just going to go through now. The first question, an obvious one that we asked them, was just, how is it going? How is formative assessment going for you in your schools? And what was surprising, actually, is that there clearly are some really good pockets of practice still. So about 1/3, just under, between 1/4 and 1/3 of primary and secondary schools report that, actually, do you know what? It's still going really well. Despite all the challenges, despite the upheaval, we've got good things going on. And another third, on top of that, think that actually they've got some stuff going really well. They've got some really pockets of good practice. Perhaps what's less positive is that there still remains about a fifth to a quarter of all the schools that we asked feel that formative assessment isn't going as well as it should, either somewhat poorly or indeed very poorly in some cases. So clearly there's a degree of disparity there, and there are some schools that are struggling to make formative assessment work successfully right now. When we delve in a little bit further to sort of say, well, what are some of the challenges and issues for you with formative assessment right now, we start to get a slightly different picture between primary and secondary. So this is the view from primary schools. And they say that, by and large, the thing that sort of occupies most of their concern at the minute is how do we keep pupils engaged in their learning? And we need to remember that we did this survey in March. So we were, not fully out of lockdown. We were still sort of just getting through that stage of doing an awful lot of remote teaching. And therefore, inevitably, perhaps this response isn't surprising to us. But nevertheless, it's a real concern that primary schools across the board have right now. And second to that, again, but I think linked to it, is providing differentiated support, which is significantly more different if you're having to do it all remotely, and you just don't quite have that same level of connection between the teacher and the learner. The picture is slightly different in secondary schools. So here we see, again, the pressure to keep pupils engaged remains top, and providing fully differentiated support is a close second. But here we see the increase of presenting a true picture of pupil progress, which I think is probably a byproduct of the phase of teaching where pupils that obviously in secondary, particularly upper secondary, are absolutely wanting to be, they absolutely want to know how are they getting on? Are they on track to achieve the results that they want to achieve for the next stage of their learning, which I think you get a little bit less of in primary schools. So again, not overly surprising results, I don't think, but certainly something to be aware of as we start to think about formative assessment going forward. We then start to delve a little bit more into these numbers, and again, we find a couple of other interesting things which I just want to conclude on. So when we ask teachers to say, well, okay, of the things that were an issue for you, how big a thing are they? And what we find here is quite interesting. So although time availability wasn't one of the top 3 things that were highlighted as an issue for either primary or secondary schools, for those schools that did say it was an issue, it was about a quarter of them that did, it was absolutely stifling. So near 2/3 of those that said time availability was an issue, it was their single biggest issue above all else. So I think we need to be mindful there that although time pressure is still a problem, where it is a problem, it is a particularly acute problem. But there's also some positives here as well. So relative to some of the other challenges, things like access to high quality teaching materials is far less of a problem. So that's great. That's great to know that there's good quality teaching materials out there. By and large, budget for buying teaching resources and materials isn't currently a problem, again, which is great to see. And really interesting to see that actually gathering insights from data and getting insights from data relative to other issues, relative to other areas, isn't a particular problem at the moment. So that was quite surprising, because we do hear from a number of schools that actually gathering insights can be tough. So maybe that's a more fragmented picture and not representative of the overall. Finally, we asked teachers to make an assessment on what do they think their pupils are most worried about. So we didn't ask the pupils directly. This was a teacher's impression of what they think their pupils are worrying about. And again, some really stark results here. So well over 90% of teachers felt that the single biggest concern that their pupils had was engaging with remote learning. How do they engage with it? How do they make sure that their learning stays on track? So which I think absolutely is a byproduct of the environment and the upheaval that we've all experienced. So clearly some of that upheaval is starting to settle down. Clearly, as we go into the new academic year in September, we hope to be in a different place with that. But I think there will always be elements of remote learning that continue, and rightly so. And I think this research probably suggests that we should continue to be mindful of how students engage with remote learning, where it's being provided and where it's being offered. So what does all of this tell us in conclusion then? Well, I think from these results we can conclude that formative assessment is not universally being done well yet, although there are really obviously pockets of really good practice. There are some long-standing issues like time pressure that are still present, and where they're present they can be particularly stifling. The newer challenges, if you will, of remote and blended teaching are also significant. And if those technologies and approaches are going to continue post-COVID, then we need to have that in mind as to how pupils engage with that. And learners absolutely feel the impact of these changes. The learners are not independent of what's going on in the school system. Of course they're not. That shouldn't be a surprise to any of us. So there's lots going on there, and obviously more research to be done on this, and it's a really interesting space to be. I'm going to stop now. I'm going to hand over to one of my colleagues. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Mark House, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about RM Compare, which is a new innovation for RM, and one that we think can make a really positive impact on actually a number of the things that I've just talked about in those last 10 to 15 minutes or so. So I'll hand over to you now from here, Mark, if that's okay, please.
Okay, perfect. Right, let me flip this slide forward. Okay, so we're going to spend the rest of this session here talking a bit about a product called RM Compare. I'm going to whiz through and sort of show you very quickly what it is, because I think once you see it, one of the beauties of it, it's sort of pretty easy to understand, but there's a bunch of stuff you can do with it, and the best way to hear that really is from Daniel, because he's doing it for real and I'm just pretending. Okay, so RM Compare we do think is quite a transformational product, because it forces us to look at things a bit differently, and by looking at things a bit differently we can suddenly see different ways of doing things, which is great. And for anybody who's interested, on the back of this call, you can actually start right now. If you just go to Compare, find that little button now, you can click on it and you can go straight in and use it yourself. It really is a simple sort of concept. The idea is that we're just a bit better at judging things if they're side by side than if we're trying to judge things against a rubric, and you'll see that in a minute. So one of the beauties of this, it really is very, very simple. And we're getting lots of people sort of all over the world taking interest at the moment. And it really is because the problem we're trying to solve at Langley Grammar is pretty much the same problem we know people in Australia are trying to deal with, and in the United States and Switzerland and Ireland and everywhere else. So that's really exciting, because if we can get this right, then we really can make an impact across the globe. But with no further ado, let me sort of show a bit of a demonstration. Now, let me come back a bit. Let me do a bit of a demo. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Demo gods, please be with me. All right, but I am going to share my screen, so let's do that. Okay, and we will flip onto this screen, and I'll just share that. And I'm going to move in my two browser windows, and Pete is going to nod ferociously to say, yes, I can see that. Pete, we got that? I'm assuming that yes, we have it. Yeah, you got it. Okay, perfect. All right, so we've got two demos. Right, so on the left-hand side of the screen here, we have one user, and on the right-hand side, we have another user. And RM Compare is a web-based system. So there's nothing sort of hosted anywhere on your on the internal system. It can be used on anything. It can be used on a phone, or it can be used on a tablet. It can be used on anything at all. I'm just going to log into that one. And on this side, I'm going to log into another one just over here. And I'm going to log into this one. And when we're in, you'll see a bit of a difference in that the one on the end has a session admin and a judging thing here. And these guys on this side just have a judging. So the person on the left here can set up sessions, and the person on the right here can judge them. And you'll sort of see how that works in just a second. Bear with me while I get another window up here to get this all sorted out. Okay, perfect. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a new session that the guy on the right can have a go at, and it's all going to be about trampoline assessment. Now this sounds a little bit weird, but as a bit of background, I was actually a PE teacher, and I had to try and assess practical stuff, and it was really difficult because you're trying to watch somebody on a trampoline or whatever, and you're trying to run it against a rubric. It's just really, really difficult. Okay, and we're going to put out, the description is going to be a test trampoline session, just for the purpose of this. And what we're going to try and do is to work out what sort of the best trampoline is to you. And we're going to look for the neatest jumper, right, the neatest person. We'll change that. The neatest bounce is what we're going to look for. Okay, and we're going to save those changes. Perfect. Okay, so I need this person over this side in a minute to take a look at some judgments to decide which is going to be the neatest trampolinist. And what I'm going to do first of all is add in some items. And in Compare, you can add in pictures and writing and all sorts of stuff. But as I said, for today, there's this very, very, very quick demo. We're going to add in some video. Yep. And I've got some that I prepared earlier here. And you'll see in this particular case, we're going to take a look at some exciting trampoline videos. I'm going to open those up. And what will happen is the items will pop up. You said, here they come. Okay. You can see you can actually add web pages. So you could add stuff from YouTube if you wanted, or you could add Google Docs or whatever you could add. And they're uploading at the moment, which is great. Okay. So while that's happening, let me just add in our judge. Is this fellow over here to the right hand side? Let me just move this out of the way. Oops. Okay. Close that. This is I need to get my judge details from. So I'll get this here, and I'm going to copy the username. So, and on this side over here, I'm now going to add a judge. I'm going to put this person in here. That's that. And I'm going to add my judge over here. So what we should see in a second or two, if I refresh this, is on my right hand side, we've got our judge here who's going to do some judging. And over here, we should now have some items which have been uploaded. So let's sort of run our session here, and it'll all make sense once you see it. So I've got some, basically what's happened here is I've got some items in, which is case is trampolining. I've got a judge in, but usually I'd have a lot more, and I'm going to run it like so. Confirm. Okay, perfect. Now my judge on this side over here, if I refresh it again very quickly, should now be able to start a bit of judging. And if they click on start judging, what it does is it brings up a couple of the trampoline examples. And what I can do is I can, if I want, take a look at this one, and I can take a look at this one. And what it's asking me to do is just trying to say, okay, so which one has the neatest bounce? And I'm going to say, you know what, I think it's that one. All right, and I'm going to submit it. Perfect. And then it brings up another two. Say, okay, so I'm going to have a look at this one. Bit of noise on this one, have a look at this one. Oh, you know what, I think it's this one. Okay. So the process, but by doing this, it's just much easier for us to work out which one is the better sort of thing, okay, than it would against any sort of a rubric. So let's assume that we've done all that. That's all been done. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to come back down here. What can I sort of get at the end of a session? Well, there's a bunch of stuff I could get, and I'm just going to bring up another one here. This is one that we did earlier using a different type of task. But if I come to my report section on here, come on, load up. Yeah, here we go. By doing that ABAB thing, eventually what happens is we can get everything in order like this, and we get very high reliability and everything's in a nice order. Now, what happened when you saw the trampolining a second ago is at the start they come up fairly random, the pairs do, but over time what happens is that the algorithm works out roughly what the order is. Then over time we get a better and better order as people make more and more judgments. In most cases you would have obviously more than one judge, and what we can get a picture of is how the judges are seeing things. So do all the judges see roughly the same thing, or is it the odd judge who perhaps judged a little bit differently to everybody else? And we can even see perhaps which items are more difficult to judge. Now, the other thing you can do in this, and this is the thing that Daniel, I think, will be talking about in a moment, is that if I come back here, you can also take another view where what you're trying to understand here a little bit is perhaps how people are seeing the judgments. Because as well as judging, you can ask people to explain why they're seeing one thing or the other. And I think I've got one here, if I come on here. Yeah, and can you see here that what we did here is we actually said, okay, you need to actually choose a picture, whether it's A or B, but we actually asked people to tell us why they chose A or B. So now we're getting into much more detail about that. And this opens up a whole bunch of formative and peer learning different options. So that was an incredibly quick demonstration there, okay, of it. And I would encourage anyone who's interested to come to give it a go themselves. So I think the best way, however, to understand compare is to actually hear from a practitioner who's using it for real, with real people, in a real example. And I can't tell you how pleased I am that Daniel is here today as a proper, genuine teacher who's going to tell us about what he's been doing in his school. So Daniel, it's over to you.
Thanks, Mark. So just before I get into the nitty gritty of what that's like, I know people like to just know a little bit of context about what sort of school we are. We are in Slough. If I just had to move the slide on. There we go. We're in Slough. As I look out the window here, I can see the planes landing on Heathrow. We are a mixed school. We're selective. We are state funded. And what that means is you get some wonderful students to teach who are really engaged. They're really, though, obsessed by their exam performances. Most of our feedback at GCSE is getting them to tell the difference between grades 7, 8, 9. Not for all students, though, and that's important, as you'll see in a minute. But it also means we have an awful lot of work to mark. You get an awful lot of work back from the students. Now, a lot of schools can say that, but that's just something, that's the nature of the problem that we're looking to solve. And it's important because we want to probably try and challenge some of the mindsets of the teachers and challenge some of the mindsets of the students. As you can see from the front slide, we're also now distinguished schools, and that becomes important because it tells you a little bit about our approach and our desire to use technology, not just to use technology for technology's sake, but because we want to use it to solve a problem. And we want to break free of traditional ways of doing teaching and learning, and we want to deliver change, and we do so in a very intentioned way with an awful lot of training and embedding of good practice. We use technology to change our curriculum, but we're changing quite well-established practices, and that presents some difficulties. I guess, therefore, we have to be always thinking through what's important, and for that, it's always going to be pedagogy. And in our school, it's closing that gap between those who might be disadvantaged and those who are not. But also, when you're in a selective school, it's very easy to see an awful lot of students succeeding, and some students who don't succeed as well as the others start to judge themselves relative to that. And so you perhaps, by self-comparison, that creates some other problems in terms of how we move all of our students and enable all of them to succeed. So what we were looking for when we looked at RM Compare was to see whether the technology had moved on to catch up with what we already knew about, which was adaptive comparative judgment. Now, I work for an exam board, and I am aware through the training that I do for my role of the problems that are associated with setting questions, certain question types, standardizing a set of team leaders, standardizing a set of examiners to get the right judgments. I'm aware of the pitfalls that you get from what was mentioned earlier on, that if you get people to judge things based on criteria as opposed to doing adaptive comparative judgment. So familiar with that, we've spent a while looking for the technology to do that. We are aware of the theory that says we can make better judgment, to give better feedback if we use adaptive comparative judgment, but we need it to close the gap, because if we use technology to do adaptive comparative judgments, we need better, more accurate judgments, and we need the children to get better and clearer feedback, and we need to do all of that whilst reducing workload, which picks up on Peter's point there about time being an issue. Okay, so with those things in mind, what I wanted to do was kind of then talk you through some of the steps that we've gone through as we've explored using RM. It sort of came up by chance, actually. In December last year, we were talking to one of our school improvement partners. He'd spent a day in our MFL team looking at how they were doing all kinds of different things. And he suggested to the subject leaders who were new into their post that perhaps adaptive comparative judgment would be a better way of marking the upcoming mock exams and getting the team on board with better judgments. And the idea was that you'd get their pieces of work, put them on the table, put them into rank order, annotate those bits of works with the differences, and the students would walk away with lots and lots of feedback, and the teachers wouldn't have spent very long or quite as long having to go through and marked. And before we even talked to RM Compare, we gave that a go with our teachers, and what we found was they struggled. They found it really hard to simply go and make a comparison between two pieces of work. They wanted to do it by applying the mark scheme and then working out which one came higher, which isn't quite what we're talking about when we're using this platform. They defaulted back to their safe zone, you know, and there's a danger when you're talking about using this sort of technology that actually you can end up adding to teachers' workload because they think they have to do the marking and then do the comparison on top. It is really hard to get teachers to let go. It's really hard to let them go anyway, but it's really hard to let go of traditional marking practices. And also to kind of appreciate that peer assessment might have a role. We've all tried peer assessment, and invariably it doesn't necessarily always do a good job. What I want to show is that you can get students to a point where these two things worked. So in December, I did a Google search and found RM Compare after years of trying to find a platform that did it. And I suppose having reached out to RM Compare, we're very quickly able to spend some time with Peter and then Mark to see what the platform was like. And Mark gave us the demonstration very much like the one that you've just sort of had. And we spent a while with our other assistant head, Nicola Dobbs, and our ICT project manager, Tara. And we had a good 90-minute conversation with Mark and looked at the platform. We demoed it. We talked about how it would work on iPads because all the students in school have that. We talked about how it would integrate with Office 365 because that's the ecosystem in the background for uploading work, and was it compatible? We talked about student logins, all the things that we have experience of being a problem when we set up new platforms. And we talked about this danger point. How do you get staff to a point where they make comparisons? And I think if I was to give one first point back, is there's a huge amount of openness for Mark and Peter in terms of developing this platform, because we weren't the only school to have had those questions, but also some of the things that we need to us have essentially been incorporated in some of the design process. And we kind of initially kept it very simple. We kind of replicated a bit like what Mark did there. We created our own comparisons. Now he gave us an example based on cats, but we went and we had a go ourselves of creating some assessments, and we compared dogs, and you can see some dogs that have been uploaded by our project manager, and we asked ourselves which one we thought was the cutest puppy, and I'm gonna bet most people go for B as opposed to A from there, but it just gave us our first experience of what it might be like to be a student or a teacher using this. It is incredibly easy to use this platform because once the dogs have been uploaded, a bit like the videos, you simply press on A and B, and you can add comments about the individual dogs. You can add comments about the differences between them as your comparison. You could go away and come back later. That's really important because that means that we could set homework for students or for teachers that have to be done at a certain thing. It was incredibly easy. And on the back of that, it gave us the confidence to quite quickly go and try it with some students. And so we did. We gave it to some year 9s. And we said to some year 9s, Mark came and he joined the lesson on Teams with us, and he explained to the children how adaptive comparative judgment worked. He talked about the principles, he talked about the platforms, and he got them to do the same exercise comparing the dogs. So on the screen there, you can see a graph. Sorry, my watch is talking to me in the background. You can see on the screen there something very similar to the one that he showed just before, and you can see that I've picked on the link, which you can just about see underneath that green arrow. Follow it down, you can see there's a little bit of blue bit of writing. You click on that and up pops the most popular dog, or is the one that was identified as being the cutest. So the students did that, again, absolutely dead easy. But then we asked them what their experiences were, and they had lots of things to say about what they saw the platform being useful for, and they had lots of feedback about the problems, and we sent those in to Mark in terms of some of the things on their minds. Interestingly, they struggled to see how it could be useful for written work. They felt very strongly that was going to be good for art, wasn't it? But as you might expect from sort of typical 13, 14-year-olds, you do need to make it quite concrete for them to start appreciating what the issues are. So we decided to notch it up a little bit, and instead of going for something quite innocuous like a dog, we asked them to put their own work in. We wanted to see what happens if, instead of rating someone else's, they start rating their own, and they all went and they wrote some haikus. You know, these kind of very, very short, snippy, snappy poems. And they uploaded them, again, more or less dead easy, straight from their iPad, straight from their Office 365 file storage areas. And they put them all up, and they went about doing the comparisons. And you can see on the screen which one came out as the one that everyone said was better. And to be fair, it's a pretty good effort. You know, and I think, wonder if they judged it because it was better because it had the nice background. And I think you'll see why we came across that in a minute. But it raised then the question that you can see on the right-hand side there. What would it feel like to be the student whose work has come out down the bottom? And that's important because you might remember I said a few minutes ago, one of our priorities is to close the gap. And what we don't really want is students comparing themselves to each other, realizing that other students are better, and that causing them to feel perhaps disheartened by their work and actually unintentionally open the gap. Okay. Now, knowing that that was actually a risk, you will, if you zoomed in, you'd see that Daniel Mace is next to it. So it's Daniel Mace's haiku that came out the bottom. Mark also had uploaded a haiku, and his was pretty far behind. My reaction at the time, well, his reaction at the time seemed to be, oh my goodness me, or something along those lines. I don't think it had occurred to him that his might actually be the worst. Mine was definitely worse. We planned for it to be the worst, but it revealed that actually the student's emotional reaction to coming down the bottom of that pile could be a problem. And I suppose it depends on the feedback that they get as a result, because I suppose an element to which they're going to have to get used to the fact that some do well and some don't. But what feedback are they going to get along the way? So one of the other things you can do in RM Compare is find out, as Mark showed, exactly what the feedback is. And that's what it said about the one that was the worst. And if you read those comments, they're okay. They're not terribly helpful, apart from the fact they can't spell really correctly, I suppose. That's why they're doing it quite fast on a Wednesday just before lunchtime. But the feedback was not great, and that led to another discussion with them. How did you feel about the feedback that you got? And they weren't terribly impressed, and that led to a really interesting discussion about what makes good feedback. And on the back of that, we then came up with a couple of principles about what would make good feedback, i.e., how do you write a piece of feedback that even the person who gets the lowest scoring, if you like, is going to learn from? And they went away and they wrote some really quite, you know, the old adage, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and off they went. And we did the same exercise again using the same haikus, and had a look at the feedback that we got. And if you have a look at what they've got in there, they're much more specific and much more helpful bits of feedback. Some are a little bit harsh, okay, but they are much more precise and more useful pieces of feedback to work from, which would then lead to the idea that they could probably go away and write a better haiku. It doesn't necessarily the point of how the student who had the lowest score felt about it. So we can probably tackle the issue of students learning how to give feedback, and we can probably tackle student performance by getting them better feedback. But we're still worried about the gap that would open up as a result of doing comparisons A and B. So armed with that, we went away and had another go with a different group of students doing something slightly different, because Mark made the suggestion that would it be worth kind of using this if the first time you used it was to look at a piece of work that had been done in the past. So on the screen, you can see what we did is we went and did a piece of work with our year 11s this time. And my year 11 exam group, they wrote a response to a mini essay question. It was for GCSE geography. And it's a question that was marked out of 8. And having spent 8 minutes writing it, what I then did is I got however many scripts you can see on the screen. I think it's about 10. And we have the student scripts with their permission, and we know what marks they got for those scripts. And the file names that I attached to it were the numbers of the marks that were awarded to the items. So we asked the students to do a comparison exercise of 10 examples of responses to the essay that they had just written, and which didn't include their own. So it was just ex-LGS students and their scripts. And what we did is we had a go at getting them to do the RM compare exercise, do the adaptive comparative judgments, do all the A-B, worked out all the way through. And this is the graph that we got. And it's quite an interesting graph, because if you look from at the bottom there and you kind of work your way from right to left, you can see that you've got the script that's marked out of 6, followed by the one that's marked out of 6, then 6, then 6, then 6, then 7, then 7, then 7. You're like, well, this is going well. Then it went to 6, then it went to 8, then it went to 5, and then 7, and 7. You're like, wow, something's gone a bit wrong there. And what we had then as a class, it was a really interesting discussion where we brought up the script that had been marked 5 out of 8, and we talked it through, and we realised that some of the students did not have quite the grip on what was needed to succeed and therefore get 8 out of 8. And similarly with the 7, they didn't quite know exactly how to finish it off. They were over appreciating some elements, under appreciating others. And on the back of that, we had another go at writing the essay. But this being quite close to their exams, and with the amount of worry that is in our student community at the moment about those exams, we didn't put their scripts on. We didn't actually do the exercise with their own work, because we continue to have that worry about what would happen. But we found another couple of things out along the way. And we looked at where the judges sat. So down the bottom are the names of the students. And what that little graph is showing you is whether the judgments of certain students were in line with the others. And the black dots that I've highlighted are where students were perhaps more generous, I think that's right, were more generous in their marking than the rest of the cohort, which begs the question, why are they generous? What have they not understood about how geography essays work? And you can go and have a look at their comments then. And I went and had a look at some students, and you could go and have a really good idea about what it was that they thought was important when judging, and again identify whether there were certain students who had misconceptions about what was important and not important about doing well. So it's very obvious to us that there's an awful lot of information that this platform can tell us, but we remain a little bit concerned about how we deal with the problem about the gap. And that takes us on to the final thing that we've been doing, which is to go back to our year 9s, but also go and talk to another year 9 group and say, we've got this platform, we know there's a lot of gains, we know there are some risks. How can we balance those two things out? So this is our next step, and we haven't done it yet. We're in the process of training up the second year 9 group, and in the next sort of 10 days or so, we're going to take the plunge, and we're going to give the homework from one year 9 group to another year 9 group, and we're going to ask them to work their way through doing an adaptive comparative judgment. We're going to include some pieces of work from last academic year where we know what the judgments are, whether we know what the marks are, so we're going to seed it, but we're going to make it voluntary for the year 9s submitting their work. So we've got 2 classes. One class has done the work, one hasn't. One class will be judging for like their own work, and the other class will be judging it from looking from the outside. And because there's definitely something to lose here, you know, these students have invested a lot of time in producing these pieces of work, we will make it voluntary at first, talk through the benefits and the risks, and give them a choice about whether they upload their work onto the platform, albeit not anonymously. And more importantly, we'll spend a lot of time looking at the students who look like they're going to underperform compared to the others, and have a look at their reaction and how they feel. We suspect it will be the students who aren't going to do GCSE geography next year, so their level of investment in it is lower, but there will be still some investment, and that gives us the opportunity to counterbalance those risks and see what would be necessary to mitigate it. What I do, though, know from working with Mark and Peter over the last few weeks or so, we know that the software platform is moving on, and we know that some of those concerns might be taken care of in terms of the user interface. So that's where we're going. We are on a on these first steps. We have tried it with students. We know that it works. We've tried it with staff. We know that it works. We tried it with different types of work. The music department are going to start uploading some media and video files as well in the next day. And so we're going to keep plugging away. And I think as I bring this to a close, I think there's just a few reflections about where we're at. The things that are definitely working well is that the channels of communication with RM are superb. We have a Teams chat, put our issues in, and there's almost not immediate response, but pretty immediate, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. In the world of working with developers, that's extraordinarily good response time. But also it's opening doors. It's very clearly opening doors to new types of assessment for us and new types of tasks and new ways of doing things. And we can see there's a roadmap from having talked to Mark and Peter towards how we can incorporate some metacognition and cross-curricular learning, which isn't immediately obvious from the demonstration you've had today, but we can see how the software platform is planned to evolve and how we can start to incorporate other elements of feedback. I guess our concerns and worries are always going to remain at the moment, not about not closing the gap, but also just how we adjust our staff and student and parent mindset. And that's going to take some time and work. So we're probably about 18 months away before we can make this part of culture, but we've made rapid progress in working out whether this thing's going to work. And we're very clear that this could almost certainly form a large part of our assessment. We just need a bit of time to work out some of those niggles and concerns, but the channels of communication mean that we'll be quite confident that we can start working through and addressing those. So that's all I'm gonna say, and I'm gonna hand back to Mark.
Wow, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. I think just that whole sort of build, measure, learn, which is what we do on a daily basis. We build, measure, learn, and clearly, seeing that from the user perspective again is the secret here. It's build, measure, learn, build, measure, learn, build, measure, learn. But it's so great to see some of the outcomes you've got. That was tremendous. Thank you very much. Who's next? Is it Mel or Pete?
I'm happy to jump in. So that was really interesting. Thanks, all of you. So just to summarise what I think we've learned in the past hour. So digital assessment has evolved a lot over the last 10 years, which is clear. So we can see that it's now engaging, authentic and accessible in ways that pen and paper exams can't replicate. Formative assessment is not yet universally embedded into the classroom, but there's clearly a big appetite there for it to be in many cases. And we can also see that RM Compare has the potential to overcome a lot of the barriers to improving formative assessment and also help answer a lot of the challenges that schools and multi-academy trusts are facing post-lockdown. And the other thing we've learned, of course, is that Mark really needs to practice his haiku writing. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that. So that just leaves me to invite questions from the audience. So let's go over and see if we've had any in. So one question which I think is probably for you, Pete, is have we got any evidence that RM Compare has a positive impact on student outcomes?
Yeah, we do actually. It's a growing body of evidence. I think probably the one to highlight mainly, which is freely published and people are welcome to go and have a look at it themselves. We were really fortunate to do a study with a university in America who did what's quite rare in education, a sort of genuine control group trial where they used RM Compare as a learning intervention. So in that sense, they did something similar to what Daniel was describing a minute ago, where they got half of their class to use RM Compare to assess the previous year group's work. And they did it for just 20 minutes at the start of learning a new topic and learning a new module. And half the class didn't do that. All other elements of the learning and teaching remained exactly the same. And at the end of that topic, it was about a 4-week learning module. At the end of that module, the group that undertook that activity in RM Compare at the start for just 20 minutes outperformed the group that didn't at every ability level. So it wasn't just the good got better. Every single student outperformed the group that didn't. So that's a really rare outcome, to find something that took just 20 minutes and 4 weeks later tangibly and statistically improved outcomes across all ability ranges. So there's many more that I could quote, but that one's probably the best example right now, and something that's really positive, a good vote of confidence in RM Compare.
Excellent. Okay, another question, which I think is probably best for you, Mark. Which subjects does RM Compare work with? And maybe Daniel can give us some of his experience as well of this so far. So which subject areas?
So RM Compare is built at the moment to accommodate as many different file types as there are, really. You can use video or audio or stuff from the web, or you can use PDF or Word files or anything particularly. And that's really important right now, because we're in the stage where we really do need to give people like Daniel absolute flexibility in what they might like to use. It may well be, for example, that if you're in an English class, you may actually want to use the spoken word for children, okay, particularly some types of children. It's still English, but that might be the thing you want to do. So traditionally, when you've seen some other platforms, they're very heavily focused maybe towards writing, which is great. And certainly in Compare, you can do writing, but we want to encourage lots of different ways of looking at it. And you can also in Compare use quite long, longitudinal project-based work, multi-page work, or you could use stuff like the haiku or even the picture of the cuddly dog at the other end. And again, that's really important, because teachers, as they go through their curriculum, will use a range of different teaching styles and tasks for the kids. It's not the fact that the kid is going to write very short, punchy answers the whole time. At some point, you'll want to do long projects. And sometimes maybe you'll want to do multimedia projects. And that's really important, because that's going to allow us to get to the point where we're able to work this out and work out exactly what to use. But I think even from Daniel, and I'll let Daniel speak, but Daniel at the moment, I imagine already has used 3 or 4 different sources of information, and I would imagine that, Daniel, you intend to use a whole bunch more.
Yeah, I can see that it ought to be possible. So yeah, you can see the narrow range that we've used in the presentation. You can see the video that Mark's got. I think the opportunity to use video is going to be important to us, because one of the barriers that we have to staff wanting to create open-ended pieces of media using the one-to-one technology that we've got is, how am I going to mark that? A 10-minute a 10-minute quiz is very, very quick to mark. Watching 30 students who've all produced 2-minute video clips adds up to an hour. And actually, you can completely switch the approach around, and you might make staff far more willing and happy to go for pieces of media. Now, it seems very obvious, as you can tell from the demo, that should be possible. But our next step is going to be to try it with music. And I'll be relatively confident that they'll have a pretty easy, straightforward experience. They just don't know it yet.
And I think so. And just on that one as well, I noticed the question was about skills. But actually, the thing which is very interesting at the moment is more around perhaps mastery or metacognition, which is not so much defined by a single curriculum area, but it's rather looking at a way that a child would maybe approach things in a more rounded way. And that's something, again, that we know we can support. And I know that's something that Daniel's looking at the moment, because, if we can get, what we sort of know is, that as a child goes up the sort of cognition ladder, as it were, okay, their way of thinking can change, and that's something that Compare can really help with to do that. So I know we're working in a very early stage with Daniel to think about how we might do that.
Okay, great. And I mean, similar to that, I've got a question, which is, so Daniel gave some examples of working with Year 9 and Year 11 cohorts. Is there a particular age group or year groups that this works particularly well with, or is it across the education spectrum?
Yeah, we almost used it with our Year 13s as well. So I think I wouldn't have any hesitation about using it with the full range. But Mark?
Yeah, we have people out in Sweden using some pretty young children at the moment. All right. There's a lot of it, like any IT, it's the pedagogical confidence really of the teacher here. Okay, but hopefully you saw early on in my slightly limited demonstration that really it is at the very basic levels an A and a B. Okay, and from my own teaching experience, I think that's quite inclusive for most children at a certain age. Now, you might not use some of the more advanced functionality depending on the age of the kid, but certainly there's use cases I can see from very, very young to much sort of older children. There's also, of course, some of the big uses we get here is actually within the teaching profession themselves, not least to understand what good looks like. And that's a major challenge in schools. And a key use case for us is, in fact, to help teachers. One of the ones we're focused on at the moment is actually for new starters. You're a young teacher out of grad school, you arrive in a school as quickly as possible. Knowing what good looks like in that school environment is a bit of a challenge. All right, so we know there's some work that we're doing around that at the moment, and we're also doing that across multiple schools. And actually, the study that we're doing, some of the studies doing now, we're doing across hundreds of schools, okay, and entire nations, which is what we're looking at the moment. And also, to be fair, we've got some global stuff going on at the moment where we've got assessors on one side of the planet, assessors on the other side of the planet, and we're absolutely sure we can help them to know what good looks like exactly at the same time. And that is a complete game changer.
Yeah. Okay. And then we've got one final question about whether I think this question is asking whether RM Compare works well if you're looking at an assessment where there isn't a single right answer.
Yeah, so that's really where it is, you know. For things which are binary, you know, right or wrong, there's some very good solutions out there at the moment. You know, you can actually build your own. If you've got your head around a Google form or a Microsoft form, you can do right or wrong stuff pretty do it yourself. If not, you can go out and buy something. But I mean, any teacher knows that mops up maybe 1% of what you're trying to achieve. The 99% of stuff is in much more in the nuanced answers that a student has given you, because that allows you to understanding, okay, particularly those higher order things. And most stuff in education is what I describe as fuzzy. You know, it's sort of it comes down to some sort of a judgment along the way, okay, and that is where the magic of the teacher and that student-teacher relationship is. You know, because if everything was just right and wrong, then we don't really need Daniel. We just need the kid to have a book and a test, and they just go right or wrong, and we give them a mark. But that's not what happens. And until this point, the way that we tried to overcome that was to compare what is essentially a subjective judgment to a rubric, and we just know that there's a number of issues with that. Not least, it's a world of pain.
Okay, and on that note, if people want to try out RM Compare and see if it would suit them, is there a way that they can have a bit of a play with it?
Yeah, if you come onto our free trial site, then which I think I'm sure you'll get. Okay, then you just click on a button, and within, I don't know, 10 seconds, you are good to go. You know, just clicking the button. I think you've got to put in your name and an email address. That's about the size of it, and then then you're good to go, and you can use that to your heart's content. And then hopefully you'll love it as much as we do, and join us like Daniel has done. And at the moment, we work hand in glove with you to work it out.
I've just put the links on screen there, Mel. They're on our closing slides. So on the left-hand side, there you'll see both the link to find out more about Compare, and also the second link takes you straight through to the free trial, which you can sign up for in 30 seconds or less with no hassle at all. We'd love to have you.
Excellent. Okay, so it doesn't look like we've got any more questions, but if anyone thinks of anything after the session, then do come along to the Knowledge Hub area of the conference website, and you can come and find us in the formative assessment booth, post any questions you've got there, and we'll follow up with you afterwards. So that just leaves me to thank Daniel, Mark and Pete for your presentations. And to let you all know that within 24 to 48 hours, you'll get a link to the recording if you want to watch any of this back. You'll also get a certificate of attendance and a short survey that we'd like you to fill out. We'd really appreciate your feedback on this session and others that you've attended at EduSummit to help us with future events. Don't miss the next session. We've got one coming up at 2 p.m. On EdTech, experiences and learnings from lockdown. So you can hear from RM's Emma Brown, along with the CIO of Academy's Enterprise Trust, James Browning, on how AET moved to a successful remote learning programme during lockdown and the lessons that they've learned along the way. But thank you very much for attending.